Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As a coach and a consultant, I go into many schools, as my listeners know, and some of those schools have a really strong, positive school culture and climate, and some of them do not. Now, I don't say that with blame. I say that with kindness, because in many cases, the schools where folks are demoralized, there are reasons for it. For example, the other day I was working in one of my more challenged schools, and the students at this school are a hard bunch. They're really difficult to engage, and they're very easily distracted by technology. I could understand why these particular teachers would be more on the negative side. When I was sitting down with them, there was a lot of that negativity. Oh, our students won't, our students can't, our students don't want to. I reminded folks that they do have students in their classrooms that want to learn, that do want to do exciting, interesting things. And that's who they should be leaning into. And also taking pride and accomplishment from those students, the students that they have been able to help. I believe just that little tweak in how they think about things could help them make shifts, because it isn't just about the students. It's also about their attitude towards the students. And if they could just make that little shift, I'm almost certain that they'll get more students on their side. So with this in mind, I'm really excited tonight to talk to two guests who are going to walk us through what we can do to develop more of a positive collective efficacy. So first, what are those things that are challenging our efficacy, our feeling that we can and will help students learn? But then how to do that in a research-based way. So my guests tonight are Jenni Donohoo. She is a professional learning facilitator and the director of the Jenni Donohoo Center for Collective Efficacy, and her co-author, Glenn Forbes, school principal and school improvement coach out of Australia. So Jenni and Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us on.
I know that there are many things we're going to talk about that are going to really resonate with folks. So let's get into it. The first question I always like to ask folks is, why did the two of you decide to collaborate on a book about the challenges to our collective efficacy and what we can do to turn the ship around, so to speak, to turn our schools around and to develop those strong school cultures that we want in our schools?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the importance of this notion of collective efficacy. We know through John Hattie's research synthesis, it is the number one factor that matters most in raising student achievement. Out of his 300 influences in his database, this is number one. So first and foremost, it's an important concept. Glenn brought a lot of practical experience to our partnership because he walks the walk every day in schools, and he has built a culture where teachers are feeling a sense of efficacy. And so that partnership was really valuable to me. And then the other thing is that as this notion becomes more popular, we see a lot of misconceptions out there. And so this was an opportunity to collaborate and to clear up some of those misconceptions.
Yeah. And how about you, Glenn? Why this book? Why now?
I think to add on to Jenni's answer, the key word in this book is collective. The book's titled Collective Impact. And if you view yourself as a solo operator or you feel like you're on your own in a school, it's really hard to tackle some of those challenges that present. But when you view your colleagues and your kids as potentially a collective, the impact that you can have collectively, harnessing that sense of positivity and growing that positive professional culture, I just think it's an important concept and the right time for this type of book, how we can use the collective to tackle those really persistent problems or challenging situations that seem to pop up in schools all the time.
And we're going to talk about it, Glenn, but you bring up a really good point, this point about collective efficacy, because I don't want teachers thinking they have to have all the answers themselves and they have to be doing everything 100% right themselves, that we are a team in schools and that we really should be looking at student growth and achievement, not just what I do in my classroom when I shut my door, but what we're doing school-wide. So we're definitely going to get into that. But before we even get into that, I'd love to learn from the two of you, what are these 12 demons, if you will, that thwart our collective efficacy and even our individual efficacy?
Well, we'll share a few of them with you. And let me share how they came to be. A friend of ours and a colleague, Tommy Thompson, came up with the idea. He said, hey, in my experience, there's these enemies of efficacy. And so we really caught on to that. And Tommy wrote the foreword for our books. We want to credit him with that. When Glenn and I started to write this book, we had identified probably 20 enemies. And we narrowed it down by looking at the research and saying, okay, what does the research say are some of these things that derail efficacy? And what is the foundational understanding through psychology that can help inform our work? And through that, we narrowed it down to 12. One enemy of efficacy is our perception of magnitude. If we feel the magnitude of the challenge is too large, it puts our efficacy at risk. Another enemy of efficacy that you just touched on when you talked about closing a classroom door really is isolation. And you're right, we can accomplish so much more together, and we've got that imposter syndrome whispering in our ears that somebody will find us out, that we don't know everything we're supposed to know. And so that isolation becomes an enemy of efficacy, as well as the feeling of judgment. So we have judgment as one of the enemies. I'll stop there because those are three, Glenn. Those are three of my favorite. What out of the 12 are you thinking might resonate with the listeners?
You chose some really good ones, Jenny, and I loved how you tapped into some of the words that John had said. A few more to add, and some of my favorite in the book were negativity as an enemy of efficacy. And John, I think you alluded to that earlier. And the way that we've written the book is that we present a theory of action. So for negativity, for instance, it's by elevating positivity, school leaders can overcome negativity as an enemy of efficacy. That's a little insight into how our theory of action that we introduced in the book can overcome the enemies of efficacy. Another one of my favorites is fragmentation. I see this quite often. School teams are disjointed or fragmented. There sometimes maybe initiative overload. And our theory through the research is by increasing focus, we're able to overcome fragmentation as an enemy of efficacy.
And the school that I was even mentioning before, where that negativity was coming from, is undergoing a challenge of having a lot of new administrators. And each administrator is coming in with their own way of doing things. And some of those ways I can see as a consultant, as an outsider looking in, are contradictory. So again, I do understand why the school that I'm working in is having some of the challenges that it is having. Now, Glenn, we had mentioned in the intro that you are a serving principal. When it comes to these challenges or these 12 enemies, collective efficacy, which ones did you see as being most dominant in the schools where maybe you worked?
You raised a really good point just then, John. You're working with a school and there's a new team of administrators, and I could only imagine the size of the challenge that they'd be presented with. And I do find that at the start of an initiative, people do express that sense of overwhelming, the overwhelming amount of work or the sense of overwhelm in terms of the progress that they're hoping to achieve. Having that sense of perspective or developing that sense of perspective through the micro moves that we've implemented. And the micro moves are on how we're able to frame challenges, I think is a great way to overcome that enemy of efficacy. Fragmentation, as I said before, is probably another big one. A disconnected team or team leaders with contradictory ways of leading can be a challenge, but by prioritizing evidence-based strategies or pruning out what may not be particularly necessary at that time could also be a good strategy.
What would you say to folks who say, my school doesn't have these challenges, or I don't have a challenge in this area? How would you recommend schools do a deep dive into the strength and the efficacy that people feel? In your book, do you go into some of the ways that schools can figure out where they currently stand when it comes to facing these various enemies?
I have two ideas that I can throw out there. One is that we suggest that the book not be read from cover to cover, that people take a glance at the table of contents and which of the 12 enemies resonate with you based on your context. That's been some positive feedback we've received so far. But I'd also suggest that in addition to the fact that efficacy beliefs influence the way teams think, feel, motivate themselves, and behave, that it's important to reflect on the strength of your efficacy. And efficacy beliefs really reveal themselves in our everyday conversations that we have, in which we attribute causes to success and failure, to the things that are either in here or out there. And efficacy beliefs reveal themselves through the tasks we assign to our students. We could, if we have a high sense of efficacy, we would assign rigorous tasks to our students because they also reveal themselves in the way we interact with our students and sending those messages to our students and our unwavering belief in their ability to achieve at a high standard. So through those expectations. And finally, efficacy beliefs reveal themselves through our motivations and the types of goals we set. I think that schools could reflect on what is the strength of their efficacy based on those criteria, our everyday conversation. So if people sat back and tried to pay attention to how efficacious do we feel, that would be a good way to diagnose it.
I was just going to say, Jenny, to build on that, in schools, John, with a strong sense of efficacy, or teams that aren't faced with these challenges, if you've got a great team and you feel like you've got a high sense of efficacy, you need to bottle that up and you need to share that magic. Collective efficacy, one of the sources, is built through vicarious experiences. So there may be a number of PLCs in a school or collaborative learning communities, and if you've got a high functioning or highly efficacious team, you need to bottle that up because some of the other groups are probably looking at you for inspiration or looking to learn vicariously through you and your strategies and the way that you lead to build their own sense of efficacy.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Glenn. And I think I'm going to take a special clip of what you just said to this one school, because one of the things I'm trying to get them to do is to adopt some standard PLC practices that they then can look at and compare and contrast across their PLCs, because every PLC is doing their own thing. And I think if they just had certain systems in place, whether that's looking and using certain discussion protocols when they're looking at student work, whether that's them using the Atlas protocol, what do you see, think, and wonder about the data you're seeing? Some of the PLCs are doing that. I know the ones I'm working with are doing that because I'm asking them to do that, but not every PLC is. Again, they don't have that standard system. But to your point about sharing knowledge through vicarious experiences, that's a great example of where the work that one group is doing that is highly efficacious can make help other PLCs or that don't have that same level of efficacy to rise in their competence very quickly. If again, the leadership is allowing those best practices to be shared and known, if that makes any kind of sense.
Absolutely. And in addition to some of the protocols, I agree completely that we need some standard processes in place for our PLC, and that idea of spreading those good practices becomes really important. There's another protocol that I love, and it's called the Success Analysis Protocol. And it's where a team comes together and identifies a success. Because in addition to efficacy being spread vicariously, the number one source is when people realize a successful performance accomplishment. So I know it seems silly that sometimes people don't make that link between their efforts and results, but that success analysis helps them to make that more explicit. And so in addition to vicarious experiences, we need to celebrate the wins and help people understand that it was what they did that resulted in a positive outcome.
And I'm glad, Jenni, you mentioned that because in your book, you talk about, I believe it's 4 main ways to establish collective efficacy. So we've already been talking about vicarious experiences. What are the 4 in total?
This is the work of educational psychologist Albert Bandura. Again, it was really important for us to situate all of our work in the psychology and the rich foundation that has been built. And Albert Bandura had done the early studies. This isn't a new concept. It's been around for decades, well studied in schools. And he identified 4 sources that influence efficacy judgments. You've named 2 of them: vicarious experiences and mastery experiences. We feel emotions. Emotions impact our efficacy. And when we feel positive emotions like excitement and joy, we boost our efficacy. But when we feel negative emotions like anxiety and fear and judgment, it diminishes our efficacy. The 4th source comes through persuasion. And that's when a credible and trustworthy other convinces us we can. So we got to think about how we can use that power of persuasion with our peers to encourage them to go out on a limb and take a risk and feel safe, and how our school leaders are persuading teachers to convince them that together they can achieve despite the challenging circumstances.
And that's how we've framed our book, John. We've framed our book by addressing each of the 4 sources of collective efficacy in 4 different parts. And then under the 4 sources, we include some of the enemies that Jenni just touched on. And the enemies connected to positive emotions are negativity, judgment, and uncertainty. And we all know that those feelings and emotions can be rife in schools, and they can be so harmful and impactful to a school's improvement agenda, which in turn then impacts how a student may experience the classroom. So our challenge was then to write a series of little micro moves or strategies to help overcome some of these enemies. And we wanted readers to walk away with something practical, something small that they could then implement immediately in their classroom or in their school to help overcome the enemy.
Glenn, so you were saying that negativity is one of the 12 enemies under which of the 4 types of efficacy?
So that comes in part 2 in our section on positive emotions or affective states, which we know is a source of efficacy. So the thinking is if you're in a school where you're feeling judged, it may limit your ability to tap into that source, the positive emotion source of efficacy.
So then what would be, you mentioned it before, and I'm glad we're getting back to it, these micro moves. What would be the micro moves to increase the positivity?
This is one of my favorite micro moves, so I know Glenn knew I was going to jump in. We have for each of the big ideas 3 micro moves. And so under positivity over negativity, one of my favorite micro moves comes from Chris Voss, who is a hostage negotiator. And he wrote a book that was called Never Split the Difference, Negotiate as if your life depends on it. And you can imagine in his experience as a hostage negotiator, how many negative feelings and had such a heightened sense that he must have been experiencing in his communication in those situations. And in his work, he has identified a very simple strategy, which is a micro move. And he's noticed that if you want to decrease a negative emotion, you assign it a label. And if you want to elevate a positive emotion, you label it as well. And so he says there's a nuance to it. Let's say we walk into a really heated argument, or there's a lot of animosity in a room and people are feeling a lot of stress. He says if you use an I statement like, I think you're really angry, it's going to not work. It's going to elevate negative emotions. He said the trick to labeling a negative emotion to help diminish it is a neutral statement of understanding. And he has 3 frames that he uses. He says you can use the terms, it seems like there's a bit of anxiety about this new curriculum, or it feels like you might not agree with what's happening here, or it looks like, and he said by using that neutral statement of understanding, you start to diffuse the situation. I've tried it. I've talked with school leaders who have tried it. It seems a little risky naming an emotion, but what he says is that it causes the person to reflect on how they're feeling and start to deal with that emotion, rather than sweep it under the rug, or it causes them to assign a more accurate label. I had a principal that shared with me that she used that recently. A kindergarten teacher came into her office very upset about some behaviors. And she said to the teacher, it seems like you're really upset and frustrated. And the teacher paused for a moment and said, actually, no, it's that I'm really sad. And so then they started to think that through. So labeling a negative emotion diminishes it, and labeling a positive emotion helps to amplify it. It's just one of the micro moves that we love in our book, Positivity Over Negativity. And it can be used by anyone at any time. You can pull that out of your pocket at any moment. So that's one example of a micro move.
Love it. Glenn, how about you? What's your favorite micro move?
In that same part of the book, elevating positivity to overcome negativity, another micro move is leveraging the power of the narrative. And Jenni, in fact, wrote with one of your previous podcast guests, John Hattie and Rachel Els. Jenni and John Hattie wrote, the greatest power that principals have in the school is that they control the narrative of the school. Therefore, a worthy challenge is to consider the strategic co-construction of a collective efficacy narrative. And another researcher, Christine Anderson, explains that a collective efficacy narrative is a story about how an interdependent group purposely creates their identity and highlights the significance of the obstacles that they've overcome together with that sense of intention and school teams shaping the power of a narrative collectively is such a great way to boost collective efficacy. To do that, the teams might just be given a challenge, in 100 words or less, describe your collective efficacy narrative. What are the things that we want to be saying about ourselves and about how we treat our children and educate our children within our context? How will we grow our collective efficacy, and what obstacles will we need to overcome? And then how will we see ourselves within the narrative? What's our role? And by planting ourselves in that role and shaping that narrative together in a positive, solutions-focused way is such a great little strategy that we can try to elevate positivity.
And one thing I always recommend in the PLCs that I work with is that they start every meeting with some little nugget of positivity. Like, what went really well this week? And as you were talking, Glenn, and having teams come up with a positive narrative about where they are being efficacious, I think would fit very well in that part of a PLC meeting.
You must have read the book, John. You actually identify the third micro move in that chapter. That one was about recognizing and celebrating progress and starting with strength. We actually write exactly about that point.
I love it. Well, that's good. That makes me feel good. That makes me feel efficacious. that I'm actually telling the people I'm consulting with the right thing. By the way, I never know where these conversations are going to go. So last time when I was speaking with John Hattie, we talked about cricket and Robin Williams. And today we talk about hostage negotiations. So you never know exactly where it's going to go. Getting back to talking about collective efficacy. Just before, Jenni was talking about a school where a principal had told her that she helped a kindergarten teacher reframe her thinking. And that was a great example of how to turn an enemy of collective efficacy into a positive conversation about next steps and reframing how we think about things. Again, not magnifying those things. Can either of you talk about some of the schools you have worked with? Where have you consulted in using your research with schools? And what's been the positive impact of that?
I love it when I get to go back to places multiple times, and I have some partnerships with some organizations, school districts, universities, and departments of education. Some of my work is in Utah. They have, as part of their legislation, a bill to increase efficacy across the state, and they're doing some wonderful things. And we write a little bit about one of the case studies in our book. But I want to mention a district that is in Pennsylvania, Tioga School District. It's a small district, but they're really digging in. And the administrators are on board. What I love is I see when they do have some professional learning, the administrators are at the table, learning alongside their teachers. The administrators and the senior administrators are admitting when they don't know what to do. And together, they are figuring it out. They're building teacher efficacy by sticking to a plan long term and not looking for the next shiny thing in the sandbox. Now, they're having honest conversations and reflecting constantly on their practice for the purpose of improving it. And that's the reward in the field when we go out and do that, where we see increases in student achievement happening because of the hard work that the adults in the buildings are doing. Washington State as well are doing some amazing things. They've got a school leaders program where they're building collective leader efficacy and have leaders coming together and sharing their problems of practice and digging into an inquiry cycle, approaching it with that inquiry mindset. And I think that's a key thing in supporting this work.
Indeed. How about you, Glenn? Where have you seen positive outcomes of your research?
Well, John, I work in a school, so I get to deal with building collective efficacy every single day and remember how challenging it can be. But recently I was in the US and I had the privilege of being in a district where Jenni was working. I had a seat at the table with school administrators, school leaders, and teachers, and some district personnel as well. And there in that district, there was a strategic plan with 5 goals essentially in the plan. There was a sense of ambiguity around some of those goals. And the challenge for Jenni through her consultancy and the activities that she developed was to build that real sense of consensus so that the people walking out of the room that day knew with certainty and clarity over ambiguity what they would consider as their next steps. And it was fantastic to watch, to see Jenni at work and to be in and around the tables, talking with people and really seeing that passion, but that passion harnessed in a really positive way, and to leave with that sense of clarity, consensus, and commitment was such a positive feeling. And to know that that district would then build on that momentum was reaffirming to see, John. And it just gave you the sense that you're doing the right work for that group of kids and that group of schools.
So let's say we have an administration or a school community that wants to banish these 12 dangers of collective efficacy, if you will. When they do fall down, though, where do you see schools and school districts falling down when they are aware of the challenges to collective efficacy? They try to address them, but something doesn't work very well. And ultimately, maybe even those enemies of collective efficacy actually get worse because they tried to deal with them and it wasn't successful. Can you give any advice to our listeners out there who are interested in improving the overall efficacy of their schools and ultimately their school cultures? What do they need to look out for? Like, in other words, what are those icebergs that they need to be looking for?
I'm not sure if this is an answer that people, I was going to say will appreciate, but I think if we understand the nature of changing beliefs, it is an adaptive challenge. There is no clear-cut playbook because it's adaptive as opposed to a technical challenge. With technical challenges, people have, for the most part, we can rely on somebody to help us with that answer. This work, and I realized we've not defined the term collective efficacy. I think I made an assumption that people would know what that is. And it's a belief that together we can impact positive change. And because shifting beliefs is adaptive in nature, there's no roadmap, as I said. So it becomes experimental, inquiry-oriented work that only the people with the problem can do the work of solving it. So for me, part of the answer is there is no answer. That's where I was going to say people might not appreciate that. But at the same time, that can be empowering because the answer is in the room. And you together can figure this out. And so what might work, and we have used the research to guide people through those micro moves. And I'm confident that if they try these things, they will see a difference. If they're worried that blame is an enemy of efficacy, we have some strategies here. And we're pretty confident that if you try these, you will overcome that enemy. But again, it's contextual. And so through that inquiry-oriented mindset, we'll try things out, come back and reflect and see if it worked and adjust accordingly.
To add on that, John, for me, if you failed at something or you tried something and it didn't work, it's about the mindset. How do you treat failure? And if we view failure as a learning experience, we probably then have flipped the mindset. If we view failure or a failed attempt as a learning opportunity, that's that efficacious mindset that will help schools and teams regroup, re-strategize, learn from their mistake or learn from the issue, and then move forward with a new sense of how they can progress their initiative, knowing what didn't work.
And it's exciting that you said that because I think it was Jenni before talking about one of the micro moves was to celebrate success. I think you could also celebrate failure if it leads to success the next time. And it takes that defeat and uses it productively. I'm really, really glad, Glenn, that you said that. So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of collective efficacy, the enemies of collective efficacy, what schools can do to turn the thinking around, particularly the micro moves that school communities might want to use to reframe thinking. What did we not talked about collective efficacy that you want the listeners to know?
One thing I worry is there's a lot of misconceptions out there in the field and they're being spread. People are defining it not according to a true definition that's rooted in a long tradition of psychology and research. And sometimes people equate it to just getting together to collaborate when it's so much more than that. And it's difficult. Understanding that it's a belief. It's not the actual ability. It's not simply coming together to collaborate, but it's a mindset. And then knowing that if you have two schools that are similar demographically, but one staff has a high sense of efficacy and one staff has a weakened sense of efficacy, that's the deal breaker. It's such an important concept. I just think that there's a lot of room to understand it because in my experience, many things in education swing like a pendulum and they come and they go, but this is too important to not get right.
How about you, Glenn? What do you think we have not discussed that's vitally important for listeners to know?
The title of the book is Collective Impact, and it's the impact achieved where there's a higher level of collective efficacy in your school or your context. And my last takeaway would be that we all play a part in that collective. What part are you playing in your team or in your school to build collective efficacy? How do you contribute to that sense of collective impact that you can achieve when you're working so interdependently across your school with your colleagues? What's your part? What do you do? What's your role? And how can you build that sense of collective impact?
Is there, Glenn, a checklist that someone could use to rate themselves and their part in developing collective efficacy?
Jenni actually has, in her previous book titled Collective Efficacy, a beautiful survey, Appendix J. Jenni also has an enabling conditions survey that helps schools and districts find a starting point. We in our book have not so much a checklist, but we do have a table that the reader can look on and with a highlighter note the areas of interest dig into right now.
And Jenni, did you want to add on to what Glenn was saying about your previous research?
Yeah, there's different ways to measure it. There are some instruments, as they would use in research language, questionnaires that have been proven with validity and reliability to measure the strength of a team's efficacy. They're available online for free. One of the ones that's most widely used is Megan Shannon Moran's. If you go to her website, you can find it, download it, and use it. Roger Goddard, also out of Ohio State University, has one that's widely used in the research. They measure collective efficacy beliefs. And I think that there's a place for those instruments if we're doing a dissertation or looking to publish a study. But I think for the work that we do every day in schools, I don't think that's necessary, and I think there's some risk involved in asking teachers to judge each other's ability or their
True,
beliefs in each other's abilities.
true.
So I'm not recommending that. And that's how what Glenn alluded to, Appendix J in the collective efficacy book, the one with the blue cover. What we did there, and this is a study that John Hattie and his, at the time, doctoral student, Tim O'Leary, and I collaborated on. We looked to see what does the research show are the enabling conditions, the things in our context, the here and now, that are likely to lead to a sense of efficacy, which is a different measure. And we've created a survey that looks at if these things are in place in my environment, it's likely to lead to a sense of efficacy. One Glenn spoke to earlier was around shared goals. The research demonstrates where teachers have shared goals and are working toward achieving them, then it's more likely their efficacy is going to be established. Where teachers feel a sense of empowerment, that's another one. So it's just a different way of looking at measuring, because those are the things that the school leaders, and that's what they're doing again in Southern Tioga. They're remeasuring a year down the road. They're working toward building those enabling conditions. And that's why I think they're having a lot of success.
Where can people find out more information about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, one of the places, the Jenni Donohoo Center for Collective Efficacy. If they Google that, they'll find contact information for me. I have my own website as well, jennidonohoo.com, and my contact information's there. If anyone's interested in reaching out, I'd be loving to connect.
Glenn, how about you?
I work in a school in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. We'd love for any of the listeners to pop out and say good day and visit my school. I'm available on LinkedIn, books available on Solution Tree and Amazon.
Thank you both for your time today. This has been a very informative conversation and one that I hope schools listen to when they are trying to develop that collective sense of efficacy and mission, because it is doable if we have the right framework and mindset. As you said, Jenni, it's a mindset. So thank you both for sharing. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.